Hello my disciples, Father Andrew here, and welcome back to Character Cross Section. This time we're going to be discussing Doctor Purnell, Sophie and the Apartment Predator from Cry of Fear. This video on Cry of Fear's characters being the last one I'm going to make. In addition to that, I may compile all the episodes into one big video, and do some editing to merge them all into one coherent thing. But outside of that, let's get straight into this. Starting with Doctor Purnell, there are two versions of him throughout the game. Ones we see in flashbacks and ones we encounter in game. The ones we see in flashbacks being the real Doctor Purnell, while the gas mask wearing version we see throughout the game is Simon's interpretation of him, created by Simon's distrust and assumptions of Purnell as a person. Giving an overview of his character, in reality Dr. Purnell is a psychiatrist assigned to Simon, seen throughout the aforementioned flashbacks, as to help Simon cope with being confined to a wheelchair, and to keep track of his mental progress due to the trauma he endured. All of which is elaborated on in the Simon video, and I'm not going to be repeating it, so go watch that video on Simon if you want context. But anyway, Simon's distrust, stemming from his damaged mental state, and his already pre-existing negative view of everyone else, leads to him writing Dr. Purnell in the book as a completely different person. One who is malicious and sadistic, willing to lie to, betray and hurt other people, doing things such as dropping false hints of a biological outbreak, expressing belief that Simon isn't even real and that everyone else around him is psychotic, despite the fact he murders two individuals in cold blood, along with betraying and shooting Simon, just before the boss fight against him starts. The decision prior to this betrayal, deciding to trust him with the gun or not, being a crucial decision in if Simon survives the ending of Cry of Fear or not. And I'm very sure in a previous video, I've already mentioned how this could represent Dr. Purnell's IRL treatment potentially backfiring on Simon, which it does in 3 of the 4 endings. Albeit Dr. Purnell in the real world, however, is a very different person. He's very clearly firstly a licensed psychologist and doctor, evident from his ability to prescribe the citalopram to Simon, and some of the advice he gives Simon. The pills by itself won't make you feel better, you'll have to do more than that. In addition to this, in Ending 4, Purnell becomes Simon's official mentor in the asylum, meaning that not only does he care for his patients, it means in all likelihood he is a licensed healthcare and psychological professional, one who goes out of his way to do as much as he can. Simon even showing that he is grateful for this towards the end, showing that Simon has realised his misjudgment. But interestingly enough, if we take the Manhunt campaign into consideration, and we treat it as canon, a note in the asylum tells us his phone number, and explains that he stopped working at the hospital and now has his own office at his own home. Albeit timeline wise, Manhunt is very likely non-canon, as the cop protagonists are trying to stop Dr. Purnell from suggesting the book idea to Simon in the first place. So ultimately we're going to be disregarding the cop campaign as canon. In addition to this, the Doctor's story, which is a bonus story unlocked after finishing the game, in which Dr. Purnell is trying to get to Simon's apartment to destroy his book and stop the nightmare. This goes directly against the established canon of the book all being in Simon's head, so we'll be disregarding this as non-canon too. And ultimately with that, that's surprisingly all there is to say about Dr. Purnell as a character. With that, now to move on to Sophie. Story-wise, Sophie is Simon's only friend, and hidden love interest, albeit Simon confesses his love to her and gets rejected, her fate depending on the different endings you get, her dying in ending 1 and 2, but being alive in endings 3 and 4 and the co-op ending. If a carcass is left alive, then you'll get either ending 1 or 2. Both endings show that Simon has killed her, dumped her body in the bathtub, and then kills himself after. Albeit in ending 3, instead he just kills Dr. Purnell and then himself, albeit he greatly appreciates Sophie's efforts for trying to help him, and simply requests that whoever finds his book spares her knowing what happened to him. While in ending 4, the only people who die are 2 cops who came in to check on Simon killing them in a psychotic state thinking they were book Simon. Albeit if you want more elaboration on that ending, go watch the video on Simon. But ultimately when he's put into psychological care, she comes to visit him. And then there's the co-op ending, which is very likely non-canon, in which the cops travelling through time arrest a hit and run suspect before Simon can get crippled and he walks home holding hands with Sophie. But ultimately regarding Sophie's relevance in the plot, it's surprisingly minimal. Simon being the only one at college who ever treated her nicely, well the only dude who's ever treated her nicely, and she always had problems at school implying she was a victim of bullying. Simon being the only one who was kind to her, both of them meeting in the college, initially, meaning they're both probably around the same age. But anyway, during the main events of the game, we only really see her through flashbacks in one scene involving Carcass. Her rejection of Simon possibly being what created Carcass, an accumulation of Simon's guilt and sorrow. But ultimately during the events of the game, the depiction of Sophie in Simon's mind via the book asks him to meet on a nearby rooftop, at which point Simon tries to talk to her about the monsters, but she has no idea what he's talking about. They have a short conversation on the rooftops, at which point Simon confesses his feelings to her, only to be met with denial, due to her mainly regarding him as a friend. Shortly after, the combination begins to draw to a close, and Sophie expresses a desire to get away from everything around them, which Simon fails to understand the meaning of before she abruptly walks off the edge and commits suicide, dying as she hits the pavement below. This being a metaphorical representation of how Simon perceives the whole situation and how it's affected Sophie, which is somewhat reflected through ending 4, when he says, "I can see the damage I've done to her in her eyes, every time she looks at me." But ultimately outside of that, when Simon battles Carcass, if he decides to kill the creature, this represents him ending his sorrow for Sophie and his failed relationship once and for all. But if you don't kill it, this represents the guilt being left to fester, which ultimately ends up killing Simon. But ultimately with that is surprisingly all there is to say for Sophie. Now to talk about the last character on this list, and that's the apartment predator, who, while there's very little information on, this is going to be more of an overview of the character than anything. As to who he is, the man we see with the shears in the one videotape used to acquire the code for the elevator in the apartments, who cuts off another man's head and drags his body away, said body having the code carved into its chest, could potentially be the apartment predator, as interestingly enough, the unknown caller who we find dead in the bathtub in the apartment chapter is wearing the exact same clothes as the man with the shears in the video, both of them wearing the same jacket, along with being mostly bald and being white older guys. In fact, they both look pretty identical. But anyway, outside of that, in regards to who the apartment predator is throughout the game, Simon never encounters him directly, only finding his secret notes scattered throughout the apartment complex, along with the addition of the picture room where he likely killed his victims. Albeit plot-wise, the apartment predator is probably the reason why in the apartments you encounter the younglings who are wrapped in garbage bags armed with knives. As mentioned when I talked about the Cry of Fear monsters, they are likely his victims. All of this suggests that at one point, before Simon started to write his book, that the killer went on his rampage, claimed the lives of his victims, and then was possibly found dead in the bathtub, and prior to this was living in the apartments without him knowing. In addition to this, the notes he leaves behind are absolutely sickening confessions of his actions, the notes implying a minimum of 2 victims. But considering how he mentions he just wants to keep killing them, it's likely there's way more, so the true extent of how many victims he's claimed is unknown. But I'm going to estimate a total of 16 victims, based on the number of pictures you can find in the picture room, all of which have notes about how the victim died. Some of them saying stuff like tasted bad, so he definitely didn't just kill them, he ate them as well. And some of them have things saying collection followed by a number which has 3 digits, or a date written on them. The highest collection number I saw in the YouTube Let's Play videos being 11, so the number of victims can range from 2 to 16, or possibly even more if this man has prior history. And it's also interesting that Simon has all this written down in his book. This implies that Simon has a good amount of information on this predator, so chances are after the apartment predator died, word about how many victims spread among the apartment, and Simon became fully aware of what happened. But ultimately, I'm gonna be honest, I did not like analysing this character whatsoever. And what really bugs me is that there's more information on this character than there is on Sophie. It just doesn't really make much sense to me from a writing point to put more effort into a background apartment predator character than Simon's literal love interest, and even the psychologist who's helping him get through things. But ultimately, yeah, I did not like researching this one at fucking all. In fact, I'm not even gonna read out the secret notes from this sick fuck because they're so gut-churning in concept that, I'm sorry, I have such a massive hatred of those kind of people that I am legitimately having to break up the recording here so I don't just get into a fucking rage, because people who do that kind of stuff to younglings, I'm gonna be honest, they should actually just be fucking boiled alive. Make their death as slow and agonizing as possible. I absolutely despise them and have had to take a moment to calm down. But anyway, it's possible that the apartment predator could also represent one of Simon's inner demons that is preying upon his innocence. And also, from what I've heard, the pictures you find in the apartment predator's picture room aren't actual real photos, they're all photoshopped. Because if they are real photos, they would straight up not allow the game to be distributed on Steam, as Steam has very strict content policies on stuff like that. But anyway, I want to move on from that. I'm just going to discuss the cops from Cry of Fear multiplayer as well. They're technically characters, so I'm just going to shove them in here so I can officially say we've covered every single one. Anyway, they're members of the Swedish police force, and they're the protagonists of the co-op manhunt campaign. And while they're voiced by Dr. Doozer, they don't really have much characterization. Regarding their place in the co-op campaign, after they get interested in Simon's bookcase and reading the book themselves, they get sucked into it, and begin a journey to stop the events of Cry of Fear ever happening by stopping the hit and run. In the manhunt campaign, however, upon further investigation, they realize that if they manage to stop Dr. Purnell from becoming Simon's therapist in the first place, all the events leading up to the book's creation would simply never happen, and they then proceed to manhunt for Dr. Purnell and capture him. albeit regarding their fates. In the fourth ending, two of them get shot by Simon in a psychotic episode. In a co-op ending, they prevent the accident that crippled Simon. And in Manhunt, they managed to stop Dr. Purnell from becoming Simon's doctor, preventing the creation of the book altogether. Regarding trivia on them, however, they all have the same voice actor, their hair and skin colour being the only differences between them. And their models were slightly improved upon the release of the Manhunt game mode. Initially, the player had to equip a radio to communicate between them in game, but this was removed because players just found it uncomfortable. And with that is every single character in Cry of Fear covered. I know this character cross-section episode was quite shallow and quite short, but I'm just glad to get Cry of Fear finished. I'm probably going to compile all the Cry of Fear episodes into one big mega episode, but outside of that I don't have anything else left to say, so see you around, goodbye.